In this video, as you watch the deep meaning images, I'll be sharing deep motivational words. Hope you'll be able to follow both of them. What if the tiredness we feel isn't from doing too much, but from standing still while pretending we're moving? We notice it in ourselves, and we recognize it in others. The way they are, not because they are busy, but because they feel rehearsed. The way we keep saying so after this, once things settle. As if life is something that will eventually arrive with instruction, clear labels, and stamped approval. We wait for the moment when it all clicks, when we are finally know who we are supposed to be. And while we wait, we circle. Same thoughts, same conversation, same private negotiation we never finish. We postpone decision, not because we don't care, but because caring feels heavy. It feels safer to stay near what's familiar, even when familiar no longer feels alive. We tell ourselves we are being patient, or practical, or realistic, but beneath that, there's a quieter feeling we don't name. The sense that something is gently passing us by. We don't talk about that too much. The part where effort isn't the problem, but the direction is. Your motivation isn't absent, just misaligned. Where the question isn't how do I do more, but why does what I'm doing feel disconnected from me? Somewhere along the way, many of us absorb the idea that purpose is that it's something hardened down by circumstance, expectation, or timing. Like a role we are supposed to step into once we have earned it. But when we look closely, when we are honest, we can see that nothing meaningful in our lives actually arrived that way. The things that shaped us emerged slowly, almost accidentally, through movement, through trying something before we were ready, through stepping into the moment without certainty and discovering ourselves there. We are already in motion, even when it doesn't feel like it. Growth doesn't announce itself. It doesn't always feel expensive, or expansive, or confident. Sometimes it feels like friction, like restlessness, like discomfort we can't quite explain. But that tension isn't a sign we are failing. It's evidence that something inside us is pressing against the edge of what is already known. We don't wake up one day and receive a clear directive about our lives. We uncover meaning the way we uncover a path while walking. By taking a step, noticing what changes, and adjusting. Purpose isn't dictated from the outside. It is discovered through contact with the media, through moments that ask something of us before we feel prepared to answer. So maybe what you're feeling right now isn't exhaustion from life demanding too much. Maybe it is the fatigue of staying where we have already learned all the lessons this place can teach us. Maybe growth isn't waiting ahead of us at some distance, milestone. Maybe it's already happening, in the tension, in the questioning, in this very awareness that something more honest is asking to be lived. We start to notice how much of life happens inside our heads, long before anything changes on the outside. The quiet negotiations, the rehearsed explanation we give to no one, the thoughts that the rope where we are washing dishes, driving familiar roads, lying awake a few minutes longer than we admit. We don't say them out loud because they sound unfinished, because we are still deciding whether they are allowed to be read. We tell ourselves we are fine. Not great, not terrible, just fine. And that word becomes a resting place. It sounds stable, responsible, but it also becomes a way of avoiding a deeper look. Because if we look too closely, you might notice between who we appear to be and who we sense ourselves becoming. And that gap asks questions we can't answer quickly. We learn to live slightly outside of ourselves, to observe rather than inhabit, to delay, to scroll, to plan instead of act. None of this is dramatic. That's what makes it hard to name. There's no crisis, no clear breaking point, just a subtle dying, a sense that we are present for our lives, but not entirely inside them. And yet, life keeps living close. It shows up in small, almost forgettable moments. A conversation that triggers longer than expected. A random memory that surfaces when we are doing something ordinary. A feeling of envy that isn't about what someone else has, but about who they seem allowed to be. Those moments don't shout, they whisper, they pass through quickly, but they leave a trace. The journey isn't something happening somewhere else. It is happening here. In this reaction, we have when no one is watching. It is a mirror, quietly reflecting what matters to us before we have learned how to anticipate it. We don't always like what we see, so we look away. We tell ourselves it's not the right time, that we'll deal with it later, when we are more prepared, confident, more certain. But the mirror doesn't disappear, it waits. You feel this most clearly when things slow down, when there's no distraction left to hide behind. That's when the internal dialogue gets louder. You start noticing what you avoid, the emails you don't send, the conversation you postpone, the ideas you keep private because saying them might make them real. You don't reject them outright, you postpone them gently, convincingly, with good reasons. You tell yourself you are being careful. You say you are protecting what matters. But underneath that, there's a quieter truth. You're unsure which version of yourself you are willing to meet. Because once you see yourself clearly, you can't unsee it. And clarity carries responsibility. What's unsettling is that the most meaningful moments rarely arrive as milestones. They arrive disguised as ordinary choices and pauses, as reactions, and the way your attention lingers on certain thoughts and not others. The simplest moments carry more weight than we expect, not because they are dramatic, but because they are honest. They show us where our energy naturally goes when we are not trying to perform. You might notice this when you are alone and no one is asking anything for you. What your mind drifts toward, what you feel pulled to explore, even when you tell yourself it is impractical. What disappoints you more than it should. Those are not random, they are reflections. The journey isn't asking you to arrive somewhere. It is asking you to notice who you are while moving. Every hesitation reveals something. Every avoidance points to a fear worth understanding. Every quiet desire is information, not a demand, just a signal. And the more you pay attention, the harder it becomes to pretend you haven't seen yourself. Not in a harsh way, in a familiar way. Like recognizing your own face in a window when weren't expecting a reflection. You don't need to analyze it right away. You just need to acknowledge it. Because once you do, the distance between who you are and who you are becoming start to feel smaller. Not because you have changed yet, but because you have stopped looking away. You don't usually notice the moment this discomfort begins. It doesn't announce itself. It slips in the quietly disguised as a reasonable choice. You tell yourself you are experimenting, trying things out, seeing what fits. That sounds harmless, enough responsible, even. But underneath that language, there's often uncertainty you haven't fully faced yet. You make a decision without clarity because waiting for clarity feels impossible. You choose something that feels adjacent to what you want, not quite it, but close enough to justify. And for a while, you convince yourself it's working. You adjust, you adapt, you learn the routines. From the outside, it looks like progress. From the inside, it feels oddly muted. This is where the experiment begins. Not the kind you post about spirituality to others. The quiet one. You stay longer than you should. You have earlier than you planned. You say yes when your body hesitates and no when your curiosity leans forward. Each choice feels small, almost forgettable. But later, when you look back, you realize that those were the moments shaping you most. Some of them feel like failures almost immediately. Others take time to reveal themselves. You remember sitting alone, writing things down just to hear your own thoughts without interruptions. Pages filled with questions instead of answers. Why am I less stressed here? Why does this feel heavier than it should? Why do I keep imagining a different version of my days? You cross things out. You soften the language. You try to be fair, but the page doesn't argue with you. It reflects. There are moments when you replay in your head, not because they were dramatic, but because they fed off. Conversation where you nodded along while something inside you pulled away. Opportunities you declined with convincing logic, then revisited weeks later with quite sense of loss. You tell yourself you are being curious and cautious, but caution, your learning can be another form of fear when it's left unexplained. Not all setbacks look like collapse. Some look like stagnation. When maintaining something that no longer asks anything of you, that's harder to admit because nothing is technically wrong. You're functioning. You're capable. You're doing what you said you would do. But there's a low level resistance you carry with you, a subtle drag of your energy that never quit lift. At the time, those moments feel like missteps, like proof you have misjudged yourself. You question your instincts. You wonder if you are bad at choosing. You tell yourself you should have known better. But what you couldn't see then is that those experiences were teaching you without explaining at the lesson. They weren't punishment. They were contrast. You learn what doesn't fit by living inside it for a while. There's a particular discomfort that comes from choosing without certainty, from stepping into something knowing it might not last. You do it anyway because staying still feels worse. And when it doesn't work, there's a temptation to label the whole thing a mistake, to compress the story into a single word and move on. But that's not how it feels when you are in it. It feels layered, confusing, human. You negotiate with yourself constantly. Maybe if I give it more time, maybe if I change how I approach it, maybe the problem is me. You revise the rules, you lower expectation, you look for signs you should stay. And when they don't appear, you feel exposed, as if living means admitting you don't fully know who you are yet. The unknown is uncomfortable not because it is empty, but because it doesn't confirm your identity. It doesn't reflect back the version of yourself you have rehearsed. It asks you to move without guarantees, to act before you feel, to accept that meaning doesn't always reveal itself in advance. It often waits on the other side of action. Some of your most valuable lessons arrive this way, not through insight, but through friction, through trying something and realizing your energy drained instead of expanded, through choosing safety and noticing how small your world becomes, through stepping into uncertainty and discovering a part of yourself that only shows up when the ground isn't stable. At the time, those experiences felt like detours, like wasted effort. You question why you put yourself through them, but now you can see how each one sharpened your awareness, how each one taught you something specific about your limits, your will values, your capacity, your discomfort. You didn't learn by being told. You learn by feeling the weight of your own choices. And there's a strange honesty that comes with that. Once you have sat with the consequences of the decision, you stop romanticizing other paths. You understand them more realistically. You become less interested in perfection and more attentive to alignment. Not in a theory, but in practice. The unknown still makes your chest tighten sometimes. That doesn't go away, but it starts to feel less like a threat and more like a signal. An indication that something new is asking to be experienced, not imagined. You don't have to frame it as courage or confidence. It is simpler than that. You move forward because staying where you are has taught you everything it can. And even now, you might still be in the middle of one of those lessons, still uncertain, still second-guessing, still writing questions instead of conclusion. That doesn't mean you are lost. It means you are learning to in real time. Every challenge you are inside of right now is shaping your understanding, even if you can't name how yet. The meaning isn't missing, it is just not finished revealing itself. You didn't understand it at the time. That was part of the experience. When you look back, what stands out isn't the decision itself, but how incomplete your understanding was when you made it. You were choosing with partial information, limited self-knowledge, and a lot of hope that things would make sense later. They didn't. At least, not right away. Back then, you measured progress by arrival points, by outcomes, by moments you thought would feel definitive once you reached them. You believed that clarity lived on the other side of the right decision, so you kept moving, expecting resolutions. When it didn't come, you assumed something had gone wrong. What you couldn't see then was how much you were learning without realizing it. You remember how impatient you were with uncertainty, how quickly you wanted answers, reassurance, sign that you were on the right path. Waiting felt unproductive, less felt like falling behind. You didn't call it impatience, you called it ambition, responsibility, drive. But looking back, you can see how often you rushed past lessons because you were focused on the next checkpoint. Resilience wasn't something you set out to build, it accumulated quietly through plans that didn't unfold, through efforts that weren't immediately rewarded, through staying present when it would have been easier to be disengaged. At the time, it felt like endurance without purpose. Now it looks more like training you didn't know you had signed up for. Some of the choices you questioned the most turned out to be the essential, not because they led directly to where you are now, but because they showed you what didn't belong in your future. You learned your limits by exceeding them. You clarified your values by completing them once and feeling the cost. You gained patience not by seeking it, but by needing it. There were stretches where nothing seemed to change on the surface. You kept showing up, adjusting, learning small things that didn't feel significant enough to matter. You wondered if you were wasting time, if you had taken a wrong turn and were too stubborn to admit it. But meaning doesn't always reveal itself during the moment of effort. Sometimes it fades until you have enough distance to see the pattern. Experience didn't hand you answers, it handed your perspective. Looking back, you can trace a line through those moments that once felt disconnected, the conversation that challenged you, the pauses that forced you to listen, the setback that slowed you down just enough to notice what you had been ignoring. None of them announced their importance. They only become legible later. You used to think the journey was about arriving somewhere stable, defined, finished, a version of yourself that wouldn't have need to keep questioning. But that version never appeared. Instead, you become someone more attentive, more honesty about uncertainty, more capable of staying present without needing everything to resolve immediately. That's the shift you couldn't have predicted. The journey wasn't a straight line. It wasn't supposed to be. It was a process of becoming, of shedding assumptions, revising priorities, and learning how to move without guarantees. Each phase prepared you for the next, not by giving you answers, but by strengthening your ability to carry questions. When you reframe those early experiences now, they don't look like mistakes. They look like landmarks, points on map you couldn't read while you were studying the terrain. They taught you where to slow down, where to pay attention, where to tend to abandon yourself, and where you begin to return. You didn't arrive at wisdom. You walked into it gradually through trials, discomfort, and repetition. Experience became a map not because it showed you a destination, but because it taught you how to navigate. And when you notice how patience and resilience formed almost accidentally, you realize they weren't qualities you need to chase. They emerge naturally from staying engaged with your life, even when it didn't look the way you expected. That's what the journey gives you. Not a finished version of yourself, but the ability to keep becoming without losing your footing. Now, when we stand in the present, something feels different. Not resolved, not perfect, but steadier. The urgency to define everything softened. We are less desperate for certainty, more attentive to what's actually happening. Clarity doesn't arrive at as an announcement. It emerges quietly, in the way certain choices feel lighter than others, in the way your energy responds before your thoughts catch up. We start to notice alignment not as a concept, but as a sensation. Some action create resistance in our bodies before they ever create problems in our lives. Others feel simple in a way that's hard to explain. Not easy, but honest. We don't need to justify them as much. We just do them and something settles. Letting go really looks dramatic. Most of the time, it's subtle. We stop forcing conversation that feels drained. We release ghosts and that belong to an earlier version of us. We loosen our grip on identities that once protected us but now restrict us. None of this happens all at once. It happens in small moments of recognition, repeated until they become normal. We let go of what no longer fits, not because it failed us, but because we outgrow it. There is a relief in realizing that meaning isn't something hidden from us, waiting to be uncovered through relentless research. It is something we make by participating fully in what's in front of us, by responding instead of avoiding, by choosing presence over performance. We don't have to solve our lives to live them honestly. We spend too much time looking ahead or behind that we missed how much was being shaped in ordinary rhythm of our days. Meaning forms there, in how we listen, in how we follow through, in how we treat moments that don't come with recognition. It is built through consistency, not intensity. And something shifts when we asking what we get in return. Giving without expectation doesn't start as generosity toward others. It begins internally. We show up into our own lives without demanding immediate proof that it's worth it. We invest effort without negotiating its outcome. We commit to action that reflect who we are becoming, even when no one is watching and nothing is guaranteed. That internal shift changes how we move through the world. We are less transaction with our time, our attention, our care. We are less concerned with extracting value from every experience. And in that release, value depends on its own. We notice patterns forming. When action aligns with intention, friction decreases. When we act against ourselves, resistance accumulates. This isn't moral judgment, it is an observation. Our lives respond to congruence the same way our bodies respond to balance. Things stabilize when they are aligned. We don't need to narrate this process. We don't need to label it as growth or progress. We just feel the difference, the reduction of internal noise. The increased trust in small decisions. The quiet confidence that comes from moving in a direction that makes sense to us, even if it doesn't impress anyone else. There's a comfort in realizing we are not alone in this, that others are also shedding old frameworks, releasing outdated expectations, learning how to move with more integrity, different paths, similar patterns, different stories, shared undercurrents. We are all learning in our own ways how to live more free without waiting for permission, how to let meaning emerge through action instead of analysis, how to give ourselves the process without demanding a fixed outcome. And maybe that's what brings us back to ourselves, not a single insight, but a series of small aligned choices. Not a search for purpose, but a practice of presence. Not a grand declaration, but a steady turn to what feels real. We are here, right now, participating, adjusting, letting go, making meaning as we go. When we look back at our lives from a little distance, they don't resemble a straight road. They look more like a canvas, layered, uneven, full of colors we didn't plan to use, placed there during moments we barely remember. The picture wasn't completed in one bold stroke, it was built through repetition.